Okay, good morning, distinguished representatives and guests, and welcome to the third and final webinar in a series aimed at encouraging policy dialogue between Brazilian and Australian industry and government stakeholders on the topic of mineral governance and sustainable development. My name is Daniel Franks. I'm a professor and the program lead of the Development Minerals program at the Sustainable Minerals Institute at the University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia. I'll be facilitating this webinar today. Thank you very much for having made the time to join the webinar. On behalf of my colleagues, I'd like to extend our warm welcome to all of you, as well as to our presenters. Before proceeding, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodians of the land on which I'm speaking today, the Jagera and Turrbal people. On behalf of the Sustainable Minerals Institute at the University of Queensland, I pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural, spiritual connections to country. We recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. Today's webinar topic is Australia's hydrogen strategy and the potential role of hydrogen in decarbonising mining operations. Hydrogen's role in the energy transition is of growing interest globally and has significant implications for the mining industry, including in Brazil and Australia. Over the course of the next 90 minutes or so, you will hear from 4 leading experts who will provide insights into the emerging hydrogen sector, Australia's strategy and roadmap for hydrogen, and what this might mean for the mining industry in Australia and Brazil, and of course other countries. You'll also have a chance to ask some questions of our experts, so please jot down your questions and get ready to ask them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. The webinars have been organised by the Australian Embassy in Brazil and the Brazilian Ministry of Mines and Energy in partnership with the Sustainable Minerals Institute at the University of Queensland. Now, before I give the floor to our distinguished guests to provide a few opening remarks, please allow me to provide you with a bit of an overview of what our webinar will consist of today. Each of our 4 experts will speak for approximately 10 minutes, covering different aspects of the webinar's topic on hydrogen and its potential role in decarbonising mining. Following our opening remarks, our first speaker will be Professor Peter Ashworth, OAM, who is the director of the Andrew N. Liveris Academy for Innovation and Leadership and chair in Sustainable Energy Futures at the University of Queensland. Then we'll hear from Associate Professor Simon Smart, the acting director of the Dow Centre in the School of Chemical Engineering, Faculty of Engineering and Architecture and Information Technology at UQ. We'll then hear from Dr. David Harris, the Chief Research Consultant at the Commonwealth Scientific Research and Industrial Organisation, the CSIRO in Australia. And our fourth and final speaker will be Mr. Thiago Alves, who is the Environment Manager for Anglo American in Brazil. At the end of our presentations, we'll hopefully have some time for audience members to ask questions of our experts. Please post those questions in the Q&A. Our speakers will answer them in real time in written form. And if we get time, we'll post some questions to the floor for our experts to answer. Throughout the course of the webinar, all audience microphones and video will be turned off to minimize any interference. Okay, that's the preliminaries out of the way. I'd now like to hand over to our distinguished guests to provide a few opening remarks. Mr. Bruno Estácio Carvalho, the Deputy Executive Secretary of the Ministry of Mines and Energy Brazil, followed by Professor Neville Plint, the Director of SMI. Bruno. Bruno, if I could ask you to unmute and show your video and please share with us your welcoming remarks. Okay, so what I might do is I'll hand over to Neville Plint while we work out the technical issues. Oh no, Bruno, you're on. I can see your video, but I just still can't. You're muted. So, Jill, if I could ask if you could unmute Bruno. Okay, Bruno, while we sort out that technical difficulty, I'll hand over now to Professor Neville Plint.
All right, good morning, everybody. I'm Neville Plint. I'm the Director of the Sustainable Minerals Institute at the University of Queensland. And I, too, acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet today, and pay my respects to their ancestors and their descendants. I would like to thank the Executive Secretary, the Minister of Mines and Energy, for your opening remarks, which we'll get going as soon as we can get you off mute. And it's an absolute honour to have you on the panel, so thank you very much for that. I would also like to welcome our distinguished panel members from Australia and Brazil, and a warm welcome to the rest of you that have dialed into for today's webinar, titled Australia's Hydrogen Strategy and Potential Role of Hydrogen in Decarbonising Mining Operations. For those that haven't been on one of the previous panels, I thought I'd just give a quick overview of the Sustainable Minerals Institute. We're made up of 6 research centres. We have a Centre of Excellence in Chile, as well as a technology transfer company, JK Tech. We have a strong track record across the resource sector, doing research work in exploration, mining, mineral processing, workplace health and safety, mine rehabilitation, water, energy, social responsibility, and governance. So you can see from that our work is transdisciplinary, it's independent, impartial, and rigorous. In addition to depth of expertise in each of the centres, what we've done in the Sustainable Minerals Institute is to have a look at developing strategic programs that we believe address future issues. One of those programs is the Development Minerals, and Daniel leads that, and the Development Minerals program is the host for these webinars. We also have a program looking at unlocking complex ore bodies, and this is really around securing future supply of materials we need as we move towards a low carbon future. And then the final program we've got is looking at governance and leadership. And that's really how we can create change within the sector. So as mentioned, this is the third and final webinar in a series aimed at encouraging policy dialogue between Brazilian and Australian industry and government stakeholders on the topic of mineral governance and sustainable development. As mentioned, the webinar has been organised by Daniel and his team in the Development Minerals program, and this has been done in collaboration with the Australian Embassy in Brazil and the Ministry of Mines and Energy in Brazil. As one of the leading research institutes for mining and for the resource sector, SMI and the University of Queensland have been at the forefront of efforts to respond to the challenges of the resources industry. We committed to developing innovative knowledge-based solutions for the sector and the sharing of ideas and research through forums like today, through the seminars and webinars and programs. We have a long and very proud history of providing support to the industry and to governments around the world as we try to navigate the sustainability challenges of both the mineral sector and the world as we know it. So today's webinar is focused on the topic of growing interest for both Australia, Brazil, and other countries around the world, and that's the role of hydrogen in the global energy transition. This includes the potential role in the decarbonisation of mining operations, and we're seeing growing interest in how companies can do that as they move towards their target of net zero carbon by 2050. So the potential to reduce the carbon footprint of mining, it's an exciting one, and it's a topic being pursued by a number of experts in UQ. And I'm sure you'll find the discussions by our panelists both interesting and engaging. Each panelist is distinguished in their respective fields. And as Daniel's mentioned, we'd just like to thank Professor Peter Ashworth, Associate Professor Simon Smart from UQ,
CSO da Universidade de Queensland e Dr. David R. Harris, e finalmente o senhor Tiago Alves, da Anglo American no Brasil. Então, muito obrigado a todos. Espero que vocês desfrutem do webinar e estou muito emocionado para as apresentações.
Great, thank you, Neville. Thank you for the introduction. Bruno, I wonder if we've resolved the microphone issue. If you could unmute and give us your welcoming remarks.
Yeah, Dave, thank you. So are you hearing now? Daniel, are you hearing now?
Beautiful music to my ears, Bruno.
Yeah? Oh, very nice. So thank you. Sorry, this is a technology problem that I cannot control, you know. I just would like to share some key messages from our
mensagens chaves do nosso parte do Ministério de Minas e Energia. Primeiramente, agradecemos.
Here, it's a pleasure, especially in the moment that you were in a few days to decide about the hydrogen policy from our National Energy Policy Council. Tomorrow, we will submit to the Council of the Ministers the guidelines of hydrogen in Brazil. So this is a great moment for us. I would like just to reinforce that Brazil is well positioned in terms of energy sector. 48% of our energy matrix is concentrated in renewable sources and 15 in a comparison with worldwide. Specific from our electric matrix side, Brazilian energy sector has 85% of renewables, while the world 28%. So the transition it's quite necessary to the Brazilian government. We are designing other policies in order to accomplish with the transition. Brazil is leading the discussion at the ONU nowadays, and from our side, specifically regarding the demand, we know that the mineral resources will demand a lot of specific introduction for energy in the process, and it's quite possible to say that the sector in Brazil will start the process of changing the energy income in the process of production and other and so on in terms of mining generation. It's important to say that not only the countries but the companies is involved in this process. It's an important view of mines and energy in Brazil that each country and company has your goals and your constraints to move in this direction of transition. As an example, I can share with you all from the IRENA 2018, the growth in terms of renewable sources in 2015 was 24%, and they will achieve 85% in 2050. So this is a big challenge for us and Brazilian. We are design policy planning in order to achieve and improve our renewable sources in our matrix, especially the energy matrix and the electric matrix. So in terms of hydrogen, it's my message here is about a decision that we will get from our Energy Policy Council tomorrow. They will provide some guidelines regarding the hydrogen in Brazil, which will support the interaction between the sectors like transport and mining and energy and so on. In fact, in this context, it's relevant to highlight the project that Brazil are developing with the GIZ, entitled Hydrogen to Brazil. This is focused on to green hydrogen and your derivatives. It will open the participation of Brazil in the the worldwide market. Moreover, this will be the big cooperation project in Latin America, and maybe the main one in the world. So, in fact, Brazil has been an important player in this agenda, with a huge capacity to produce green hydrogen. We have some examples, like the hub of hydrogen in the Ceará state, the northeast part of Brazil, between the Brazilian government, between the Ceará government, state government, and also the Fortescue, a big company that has been a good interaction with Mines and Energy, in which they will invest around 6 billion and generate 3,000 employees. This will, in fact, change the new paradigm in this sector in Brazil. Concluding my words in final remarks, my colleagues, we have a great opportunity to the mining sector in terms of mineral production, reducing the emission of CO2, and using this in the process when which the Anglo, for example, will develop in the continent of Brazil. So this is a agenda in which we need a great effort between public and private in order to build a win-win partnership. If the future is green and sustainable, in fact, it will surpass by the energy and mining sector. So thank you, Daniel. Thank you, my colleagues. Sorry to be a problem in my technology, but I cannot control. But in fact, we are totally committed with this kind of agenda in Brazil, adopting the best practices worldwide and developing policies taking into account the transparency, the predictability, the interaction of the agents, and also the regulatory safety in terms of in which it will enter in our matrix. So thank you again. Have you all a good event here and great discussions about this important agenda.
Thank you very much, Bruno. Thank you very much, Neville. Really great context for our conversation and our session today, and an interesting moment in Brazil that maybe this webinar is quite relevant to the potential changes in policy that may be happening imminently on hydrogen. Okay, now let's get into our speakers. I'd like to now first introduce our first speaker of today's webinar, Professor Peter Ashworth, OAM. Peter is the director of the Andrew N. Liveris Academy for Innovation and Leadership and chair of the Sustainable Energy Futures, chair in Sustainable Energy Futures at the University of Queensland. She's been working over 30 years in this space in research, management and consulting roles. For almost 2 decades, she worked in researching public attitudes toward climate change and energy technologies, including wind, carbon capture and storage, solar photovoltaic storage and geothermal. Her contributions to the field of sustainable energy include leading a social science research program at the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute. She's also worked alongside Australia's chief scientist in the development of Australia's national hydrogen strategy, and most recently been working with the Queensland government here in Australia on their hydrogen strategy. She was awarded the prestigious Order of Australia Medal in 2019. Peter, I'll hand over to you for your presentation.
Thanks, and I'm sharing my screen. Can you see that, Daniel?
I can, thank you.
Perfect. And first of all, could I too acknowledge the traditional owners on the land of which we meet today, and also acknowledge the distinguished guests online, and thank you very much for the opportunity. I thought I would take the approach to give a bit of an overview very quickly of hydrogen and decarbonisation for the audience, but also focus on Queensland, obviously with my role as chair and where we are. So why hydrogen? I've just moved screens, so hopefully everyone can see that. I don't think probably anyone on this Paul wouldn't know that obviously the low carbon potential for hydrogen. In my research as a social scientist, we've run national surveys for many, many years. And it's quite interesting that up to 2017, hydrogen wasn't actually one of the technologies that we used to investigate. But now it's firmly on the radar, both in Australia and internationally. So I think, you know, this whole move to decarbonisation is really driving the urgency for why hydrogen is actually coming into play. And I think the fact that it can be used as an energy carrier when electrons are not the optimal choice is the other thing that makes it attractive. And obviously we're looking here, the early opportunities, which also I think tie into the mining, is long haul trucking, the integration of renewables and export. And obviously the idea that we can store hydrogen or helps with storage over longer term is really useful when we've got that variability being introduced from renewables. And obviously industrial applications that we're seeing emerge. And I think that's particularly relevant for the discussion today in mining and minerals development. And I guess the other idea is that it does give us diversity in our fuel choices as we sort of move down the sort of renewable electricity and so forth. One thing I did just want to mention is there's a lot of conversation about the colours of hydrogen. This has always been on the discussion, but I think the most important thing is really the ultimate is the green hydrogen, hydrogen from electrolysis of water using renewable electricity, and obviously with no carbon dioxide emissions. But there is still discussion here in Australia and also internationally about blue hydrogen from where you're capturing the CO2 using carbon capture, utilisation and storage. But I think the holy grail here is for green hydrogen from electrolysis. And I think this is where we can think about closing the loop for mining as well. But I did want to point out for those online, the federal government right now is investigating a hydrogen guarantee of origin scheme, and I've included a link to the website because I think this is very important internationally right now. So trying to establish a guarantee of origin scheme is really has become it was a priority action out of the National Hydrogen Strategy. And the whole idea here is developing a methodology that is recognised internationally. So Australia is working with international organisations on this, but there is a document that's out for consultation now. And what it's trying to look at is that idea of, well, what is clean hydrogen? What is, and is it that we only use green, or are there ways that if we can certify that the CO2 has been captured and stored, should that be considered? So there's a whole discussion going on both here in Australia and internationally, and I thought it was something that would be relevant to Brazil and also Brazil-Australian conversations. So I did just want to mention that, and it's also something that we're looking at in Queensland. So I guess that I thought I'd take a Queensland approach just because obviously it's relevant both here, and it really is tying in with how do we develop the hydrogen strategy from a state perspective, but coordinating with the whole with the rest of Australia. So I guess we're looking at this coordination between jurisdictions. Some of the high priority areas that we've got is how do you aggregate hydrogen demand, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. The idea of attracting early private sector investment, we already heard the Minister talk about public-private partnerships, and we think this is a real opportunity to create value. The new jobs and skills creation that can happen as a result of a growing hydrogen industry, I think, is very attractive, not only for the state, but also for regional development as we transition many of our industries from traditional fossil fuels, and this opportunity for long-term strategic partnerships. So when we deliberated, there's a group of Director Generals from within Queensland Government as well as external task force members. These were some of the priorities which I thought would be interesting just to reflect on a little bit, not in great detail, but I guess one of the key things if we're thinking about developing an export market is what is the narrative that, you know, articulates those opportunities. And I think when we hear from the other panel members, we'll hear a little bit about how that's solidifying. It's a new challenge around revenue policies with hydrogen. It's a little bit different from traditional exports, and I think that's something that many governments are grappling with here, and in Australia definitely. What is the revenue model that could be used? And also the opportunity of what are some commercial models. With the shift to ESG focus, there's a lot of financial institutions interested in developing and investing in different green, I suppose, projects. So I think this is an opportunity to think about new ways of sort of public-private partnerships from a commercial aspect so that governments don't have to do all the heavy lifting. There's a lot going on. You'll hear the word precincts, hubs, valleys. How do we coordinate this so that it is, everyone can win, that it's a long-term goal, not only sort of near, but also over time as well. So we need to coordinate how energy and also port assets and the policy environment is important. And obviously with that goes the regulatory issues. As a social scientist, there are social license issues. If we look at the scale of ramping up the renewable energy that's required, there's going to be some real issues around challenges of water use and also competing land. We've got a lot of farmers that have worked in Queensland as cattle farmers and so forth. And if we're suddenly saying, well, actually now you should become a solar farmer, there's some real identity issues that we're going to have to think about. And then the other thing that we are grappling with is this idea of blue versus green hydrogen. Obviously, green hydrogen is the goal, the end goal, but is there a role for carbon capture and storage and blue, and how does that work on the international market? So this is sort of some of the issues that we've been working on, which I think are relevant to any country that's starting to think about this. And we have done some engagement with industry as well. And I'm not going to go into great detail, but I guess one of the key things when you're starting this at the moment with hydrogen, obviously the economics is the biggest challenge. So while we're developing something that could be potential export, the idea of actually being able to create domestic offtake is really seen as critical. And I think this is where remote mining operations and so forth come into play, because with large-scale renewables, there's a really nice, neat way of actually getting some rungs on the board and closing the loop through this. So I think understanding who can be the off-takers is a key role that both industry and government can think about. Understanding the commercial realities is a big challenge. And again, it comes back to offtake and then this idea of where does the capital come from. We need to get the price right. And again, this links to scale. So you can see there's some common messages, I think, that is coming through. One of the things that is critical, I think, is how can we utilise shared infrastructure? There was a lot of learning in Queensland around coal seam gas and our LNG exports, which I think everyone is very aware of. And there's a lot of discussion around this idea of transport. Is it, what is the optimal? Is it through electrons? Is it through pipelines? And it won't be a one size fits all. But I think also the beauty of when we're thinking about mining is that you can close the loop and think about how that moves within an organisation, I suppose. So I just wanted to grab one of these pictures. There's so many right now that shows the hydrogen ecosystem, but I think this is what's exciting about hydrogen in itself, that, the different ways that we can generate hydrogen, but also use it. And I think, from the point of view of actually with what's happened in geopolitics right now, if we can produce hydrogen, use it for its different advantages as an energy carrier, storage and so forth, it does actually help build, de-risking the sovereign issues around it. And also, I think once we get the economics right, it actually provides a real opportunity for reducing costs in remote mining, remote communities and those sorts of things. Now, it's not proven yet, and there's still a few unknowns as to how it will be transported. But I think, as I said, there's a lot of discussion about hubs. The Mission Innovation talks about hydrogen valleys. In Queensland, we talk about the different precincts. But I think there's a lot going on, and you'll see these similar ecosystems of the opportunities that hydrogen presents. So So I guess one of the things that we've talked about a lot forever, from the hydrogen strategy is the opportunity that hydrogen presents for long haul. The fact that, you can go large distances, it's light, the fuel cells are relatively light. So whereas batteries can be quite heavy, although there are some different, obviously, opportunities for those. And I think, this is where we can see that for transport around hydrogen hubs and other applications, obviously biofuels come into play here and hybrids. And I guess that's another strength of Brazil, I know from the work that I've done with my colleagues over there. And this idea that we're seeing how hydrogen could really reduce emissions. So for the state of Queensland that has aggressive goals to reduce their overall emissions through renewable energy, being able to decarbonise parts of the mining sector in the Bowen Basin and other parts, but also continue to produce the critical minerals that's required, I think is a real opportunity. And then as I talked about this sort of planning and shared infrastructure, as we move away from different processes, I think there's also the opportunity that might free up water allocations that can then come into this. And I think later on, some of the colleagues will talk more around that systems approach. But I think what we're also seeing and I know with some of the industry is this idea of these systems of actually, if we converted our trains away from diesel as well for carrying goods, that will help. So there's a lot of discussion going on. And I think this is where hydrogen provides some real opportunities. And then I guess the other part of this is what's still not clear is, the role in shipping in particularly. But I think there's a lot of discussion going on right now for shipping to sort of move across to ammonia or others to clean up the international shipping regulations. And I think, again, this creates real opportunity to think about, well, what else can come out of this hydrogen industry? So, of course, Simon's going to talk more about the different ways. So it is hydrogen, but it could also be ammonia and those different options there. So I'm just going to leave that there. I hope that gives you a little bit of some insights into what are some of the things we're grappling with that I think are probably relevant to any country or region that's actually thinking about hydrogen. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Peter. Excellent overview, given us a really good strategic overview of the current status of hydrogen and the opportunities. Our next speaker is Simon Smart, who's an associate professor in the School of Chemical Engineering and a senior research fellow at the Dow Centre for Sustainable Engineering Innovation. He's also the director of the Functional Interfacial Materials and Membranes Laboratory at the University of Queensland. Simon's research is centred around sustainable production and use of energy and chemicals. He leads two distinct research groups. The first is technical in focus, developing the enabling technologies and processes for the production of clean energy, materials and water. And the second is a broad research program around encompassing the role of energy in society and how fast we're currently decarbonising the global economy. Welcome, Simon. I'll now hand over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. And I assume you can see my screen and hear me well?
Can see your screen. We can hear you well. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I'd also like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we're all meeting today virtually, and also thank everybody for the opportunity to talk to in such a distinguished setting. So my 10 minutes, I guess, is largely going to focus around Australia's hydrogen strategy. I was asked to give I guess a relatively high level overview of it. And I might also touch on how the hydrogen strategy links in with the broader technology investment roadmap as Australia moves towards its climate targets in the future. Peter or Professor Ashworth has obviously given us a very good overview as to why clean hydrogen is essential as we move into the future. It's a versatile energy carrier and feedstock. It enables deep decarbonisation. But unlike some of the previous energy revolutions, or even the more recent energy revolutions that we've seen around wind and solar and are now seeing with batteries, hydrogen has uncertainties on both the supply and demand side. And I think that's what makes it such an interesting challenge moving forward. So whereas, from a solar perspective, the demand side was simply the electricity users and all of the infrastructure associated with getting the electricity to the end users was already there and built. And solar largely simply had to focus on bringing down their cost curves for supply. Hydrogen, even though we have 70, 80, 100 million tons used around the world every year, is very uncertain when it comes to demand at the moment. The way in which we move hydrogen around is uncertain, and the way in which we produce hydrogen is uncertain. So what I'd like to do is just touch on a couple of those uncertainties first, and then move into talking about the National Hydrogen Strategy. So one of the uncertainties is what's the best way to produce hydrogen? And this is where a lot of my research, my own individual research work is. And the answer is, Peter pointed out before, we've got all of these different colors. The winner for best production technology is, we don't know yet, because we're unsure as to how things are going to proceed. So we can make hydrogen from fossil feedstocks. We do this already with coal and natural gas, forming something like 95% of the world's hydrogen that's made already. When we combine these with carbon capture, utilization, and storage, we end up producing blue hydrogen. This is technologies that are favored for large-scale production in centralized facilities, but we obviously have to accept the carbon capture and storage realities of it, and the fact that it's not completely CO2 free of blue hydrogen. On the green side, we can make it from biomass, or as everybody's envisaging at the moment, the ultimate end goal will be through water, through electrolysis of water. And we can combine that with other technologies to make different hydrogen carriers, because we're not really sure what the best way of moving hydrogen around is actually going to be. Will it be gaseous hydrogen in pipelines? Will it be liquid hydrogen? Or will it be a hydrogen carrier like methanol or ammonia, or a liquid organic hydrogen carrier as well? So in addition to not knowing what the best technology is, we also don't know what the best supply chain is. And this is my version of Peter's slide before. It doesn't have quite so many nice pictures, but I think it gives the same overview. And I guess what I wanted to highlight here is that we've got these multiple ways of producing hydrogen. We're not sure what mix of those will move forward, but ultimately we're thinking something green. And then we need to move it around from the producers to the end users. And the question then becomes, how do we do that? Do we do it via pipeline? Do we, and then send it to storage, use it for transport? Do we liquefy it to ship overseas? Or rather than liquefying to send overseas, do we convert it into another hydrogen carrier, again for domestic use and transport, or export? We can turn the hydrogen into industrial uses as well, heating, back to power. We can even, and these are options that are,
Podemos ter até opções que estão ganhando momento em locais como a Alemanha, que é o converter para
natural gas infrastructure and natural gas transport pathways and supply chains in order to effectively create green gas. So all of this here, there's lots of uncertainties as to which way it will proceed and whether things will be large and centralized or small and decentralized. Whether it's better, as Peter said, to move electrons around to produce the hydrogen, or whether it's better to move hydrogen around from the source. So in forming its own strategy, the part of, and in contributing to the national strategy, the Future Fuels Commercial Cooperative Research Centre did a bit of a survey, a global survey of about 19 different hydrogen roadmaps in order to find some common similarities between them. So obviously, what did they find? Well, the drive to reduce carbon emissions means that hydrogen is now very much on the radar. As Peter said, 10 years ago, it was something that was not talked about that much. In the last 5 years, it has become the hot topic. As I've said, there's lots of uncertainty about how quickly the costs will drop and how the technologies will change and efficiencies will improve and the supply chains will develop. And so there's questions then around how do you prioritize funding for different technologies based on their levels of maturity and potential. In terms of the more mature technologies tend to be blue at the moment, but ultimately we want to move towards the green. Interestingly, more countries are focused on using hydrogen in their roadmaps than they are on producing it. Australia and Brazil might be different in that respect. Certainly Australia is very much focused on being a hydrogen producer. And that the core focus of any new strategies really should reflect the broader international environment. And really importantly, they should address the logistics of the transition to hydrogen, the practical barriers to scale up, and should seek to build on the comparative advantages of the country or state in which the roadmap is being developed for. Clearly, access to low-cost renewable electricity is going to be critical for both hydrogen domestic economies as well as export. And it appears that, at least in the short term, the availability of carbon capture and storage is going to be an important aspect as well. If we proceed down the blue hydrogen path. And importantly, and Peter touched on this a little bit with regards to the Guarantee of Origin scheme, international producers and users need to collaborate on standards. They need to collaborate on standards and certification, and they should probably collaborate on technologies. In forming the national strategy, the task force looked at a range of scenarios that for hydrogen deployment around the globe, and they ranged from hydrogen being the energy of the future through to electricity being the fuel of the future, effectively, and an in-between targeted deployment scenario. Considering those three scenarios alongside business as usual, enabled them to develop a range of, or to identify some pathways, and more importantly, to identify some signposts that the world is heading towards one of these three possible futures. And rather than develop overly prescriptive policies, they looked to take an adaptive pathway approach, which is essentially to take action, review and revise, and watch for signals as things develop, and then adapt their pathway as they proceed. So that really had two phases. The first phase is out to 2025 and is really focused on demonstrating and promoting demonstrating hydrogen as a technology. And in particular, that comes back to this idea of developing and promoting hydrogen hubs as or precincts or valleys, depending on the language that you want to use. This is a way this advances pilot trials, advances demonstration projects, and I think most importantly, develops supply chains, or at least smaller supply chains, and grows demand, both domestically and from an export perspective. Because I think the demand side is probably where the most uncertainty comes in as this industry develops. And Peter mentioned earlier that, offtake agreements are perhaps the best metric for how things are proceeding. And I would tend to agree with that as well, because it demonstrates clear demand to producers. So these hubs are integrated facilities. They have producers and users together, sharing co-located sharing critical infrastructure, and they're looking to maximize benefits and economies of scale between all of the individual users. They may also discover additional synergies where wastes from some users or producers may end up being feedstocks for other users and producers. So I think that would really then demonstrate sort of true integration of all of these different industries. And I'll show you how in a map in a little bit as to how those are starting to develop around Australia. And the real advantage of focusing on these hubs first is that you get to look at growing the demand, answering some of the production questions without having to answer any of the transport and necessarily storage questions. So rather than having to develop full supply chains across the entire nation, you can develop localized producers and users together near export facilities to answer some of the most critical questions first. Then we move on to large-scale market activation from 2025, and this is really a watch and adapt approach. In terms of their measures for success, they wanted excellent safety records, jobs and benefits, to be a top 3 exporter, and as Peter said, a certification scheme. Really quickly, I just wanted to give an overview of what's happening at the moment. This is a current update. We've got 66 projects, 6 are operating, 10 are under construction, and about 50 are under development around Australia, with 10 of those expected to reach final investment decision this year. And the very last thing I wanted to say before wrapping up was that the hydrogen strategy sits inside, it was developed first, but I guess it sits inside a larger technology investment roadmap, which is really focused on bringing down the nation's emissions. And the way in which it sits there is through through prioritizing technologies. Clean hydrogen is one of those, and setting stretch targets. So from a clean hydrogen perspective, our stretch target is to produce clean hydrogen at less than $2 a kilogram Australian. And with that, I'd like to wrap up. Thank you very much for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions on the chat or later on.
Thank you very much, Simon. Excellent presentation. I really appreciate you talking us through Australia's strategy, how it fits in with the other technologies that Australia is introducing for emissions reduction, and also, you know, how a country scales up from demonstration through to commercialization of the sector. Excellent. We have been receiving some questions and answers coming in on the Q&A function. I encourage you all to throw some questions at our speakers. You're most welcome to do that in Portuguese as well, because we have a Portuguese speaker coming up as part of our expert group. We can also do our best to answer those questions as they come in. So now I'd like to ask our third speaker, Dr. David Harris, the Chief Research Consultant for CSIRO Energy Australia, up to the floor. David leads the development of major projects and initiatives focused on providing technology pathways for low emissions technologies to increase efficiencies, reduce costs of greenhouse gas reduction, as well as secure sustainable energy supply. He works across the major energy technology sectors, including solar, thermal, solar PV, advanced thermal and electrochemical engineering processes, hydrogen and emissions monitoring and modelling. He has well-established collaborative links with major energy research technology institutions with Australia, but also internationally, Japan, China, Korea, Europe, USA, India, and South Africa. Thanks for being with us this morning, David. I'll now hand over to you. So, David, I still have perhaps you on mute, or I can't hear you at least.
Sorry, the button moved.
There we go.
Thank you very much, and I'm glad to be here. I got up this morning to find all the internet was gone and our corporate system not connecting. So after a little panic, we're here. So look, thank you very much for including me in this seminar. It's a really important topic, and as Simon and Peter have clearly pointed out, this is a global initiative, and collaboration is absolutely fundamental. And let's say it's not new. You know, the industries around the world have been working with hydrogen for a long time, mostly in situ for all sorts of reasons, as we've been pointing out. And the reason I wanted to reinforce that point about it not being new is that we have industries, high energy intensity industries at scale, in many of these important value chains, including mining, power, manufacturing, agriculture, etc. And much of those systems are already at scale, are already efficient, and are readily amenable to decarbonisation through hydrogen, green hydrogen integration, and through renewable energy.
If you don't mind me interrupting, David, if you can put your video on, that'd be great. If you can't for technology reasons, that's fine too.
No,
beautiful.
So the point being that we need to and can leverage the technologies and the value chains and the scale that we have already and the infrastructure, because to begin from scratch is prohibitive from the demand side, because the industries would have to shift and the supply wouldn't be there, and we would not reach the scale that we would need in the timeframes that would even allow the industry to be viable. So leveraging with our existing industries is absolutely key. And we also need to look across all of the renewable inputs, and that will suit different tech industries, different technologies differently. That's why we consider things like solar thermal, like gasification of biomass and so forth, and hydrogen carriers such as ammonia. Oops, how am I? So yeah, with that bit of background, it's about keeping alive all the options, because we need all the options for scale. Hydrogen is not new, so many of the technologies that we associate with production and use of hydrogen have been developing for some time, but not in the sectors that we're now talking about, and not at the scale and, if you like, the unity of the sectors that we're talking about. There are certainly key science and technology breakthroughs needed, and many of these are about joining dots, about connecting renewable energy sources with large-scale industry. And some of that exists, some of that doesn't. But to decarbonise those industries doesn't necessarily mean we have to completely change the back end of those industries. But what it does is greatly increases the connectivity between what we used to consider the renewable energy sector and the different industry sectors, which traditionally don't work together. Power, manufacturing, transport, agriculture traditionally have not been intimately integrated. Now we see that they will be, they'll need to be, and we're challenged by scale and cost. I'm going to focus a bit today, because we've flagged that in the strategy, on things like ammonia. So how do we get hydrogen from where we have sources or opportunities to produce hydrogen from lots of renewables to where we need it, into the industry need it. Now, ammonia is an example. We'll touch on some others, but these sort of approaches are providing bridges not only to markets, but also to other players in the industry sector. We have ammonia industry already, for example, who are very good at what they do. Now, the only way we're going to be able to do that is through collaboration and partnership in areas that traditionally haven't been strong, because the industries have been somewhat separate, research industry and government. And that's what we're seeing from the examples that Peter and Simon have described as well, not just in Australia, but in many of the countries that we work with. But the real barrier, from what I can see and from what I've gathered talking to people, isn't just about understanding the component unit technologies. It's how do we get breakthroughs in the pilot and demonstration scale, so that the various players can see the viability of those connections and links and get the technologies to scale and relevant to where the industry needs them to be. And that is a real gap, because there's a lot of infrastructure needed, and it's quite expensive, and it is logistically difficult between supply side and user side. Simon's covered this brilliantly, and Peter, the Australian government approach through the roadmap and the technology investment plan that's underway. I won't go into that into detail. Simon's covered it well. Just to highlight again that a series of technologies sort of have been chosen as the government's priority technologies. They're differentiated often when people talk about them: clean hydrogen, energy storage, low carbon,
So David, I think we've lost you, lost your audio and your video. I wonder if this is one of
Storage and transport of energy.
You're back. Thanks.
So hydrogen is a energy carrier. It's not a fuel or an energy source in its own right. Am I dropping out? I'm getting a message from my internet.
You were, but you're now back. I think you made the right decision maybe to drop your video at the start, and I encourage you to do otherwise. So maybe if you dropped your video, we'd just go audio. That'd be the best solution.
Sorry about this. So I see them as all intertwined technologies. But it does have to be practical, and it's really simple. If you look at it simply, all we've got to do is make the hydrogen, move it, and use it. But each of those steps in the scale and in the complexity of our energy systems is not trivial at all. I'm not going to, we've covered a bit on how do we make hydrogen using different pathways, green pathways. Moving it, I find, is a real challenge because it is, we often have a plethora of renewable energy not in the places where we need to use it. The oil industry and others have addressed this through international shipping. How do we utilise some of that infrastructure to make that work for countries that really don't have a lot of renewables? And can we move it in a form where we can use it? And I'll touch on that as we look at some of the aspects of the value chain because it's messy. This is another version of the diagram we've seen, but just in a figurative way to point out that we do need to bring all of the renewables together. Peter highlighted the electrolysis pathway. We've also got opportunities for solar thermal technologies here where we need energy storage potentially as heat, which in some situations is preferable, and integrate with processes which are somewhat conventional for producing hydrogen. Likewise, biomass, agricultural industry, in Brazil, I've worked with some of my colleagues there in the sugar industry, a lot of opportunity and very advanced biomass conversion technologies there, which feed into this pathway very nicely, be it directly to hydrogen or as other carriers, as Simon has pointed out. I want to focus a little bit on ammonia as a hydrogen-free carrier, partly because we've already got ammonia circulating around the world as one of the largest traded chemicals. And we have the infrastructure, we have the ships, we have the safety regulations, we have the markets, and it's very well understood. That is a platform which, combined with our current ammonia industry, can take as much renewable ammonia into it as we can produce at the moment. And ultimately, the transition to fully green ammonia is certainly feasible. So that industry can work very closely, the ammonia production industry and the transport industry, in helping to pull forward the opportunities for these renewables to hydrogen pathways. As I already mentioned, we can then ship ammonia around the world and convert it back to pure hydrogen. It has to be pure hydrogen. And this is one of those dot joining, door opening technology areas where we've done quite a bit of work and have now got a membrane technology that we're developing with Fortescue Metals Group, which enables us to take ammonia and crack it back to pure hydrogen at the point of use, using a 100% selective membrane technology, opening the door for this whole value chain then into high-value hydrogen use around the world. We don't always have to do that. If we're using ammonia or methane or other hydrocarbons from renewable hydrogen, we can use that directly. And ammonia particularly very attractive in the remote mining sector for power generation, supporting renewable technologies where we have intermittent issues. We often have diesel generators. We can run those generators on ammonia directly. We've got work looking at diesel electric locos converting to ammonia. The shipping industry itself looking very strongly at ammonia. MAN diesel and turbo will have an ammonia at a large-scale two-stroke engine by 2024, for example. And of course, we have high-temperature fuel cells, which can run ammonia directly. We don't always need pure hydrogen. So really important that we look at the combinations. In my view, there is no winner. They're all winners. And our job is to try and connect those dots to help the industry be able to adopt those and bring them to scale. Just as an example, one of the projects of interest immediately where we can use effectively the engines we already have is in direct utilisation of ammonia in power generation for backup or for remote areas. And just as a bit of a highlight, some of the work that we're doing is looking at initially about 95% diesel replacement using a small amount of diesel for ignition purposes. And we've got quite a bit of work going on the fundamentals of ammonia utilisation in engines to give us that experience. And we've got a range of slow speed, medium speed, and even some turbine systems looking at how we can utilise ammonia directly and ultimately replace diesel in what really looks like some of the existing systems we have. And to reflect again back on the diagrams that Peter and Simon showed, and I've purposely chosen an old one here because much of this ecosystem is not new. What is new is how do we bring into this system via gasification or some of the other pathways, how do we bring into it the somewhat intractable energy sources such as municipal waste, biosolids, biomass, etc., into these processes so we can take advantages of the chemistry and the scale, the industry and the knowledge that's already there. And as I say, much of this is in place. It's a matter of working with the locations in Australia. We don't do much with waste, but a great opportunity here for us to solve a couple of problems at once. So using the old technologies is not bad. And a lot of work's been done on CO2 storage, which we really need to take advantage of. Similarly, bringing some of the newer emerging technologies, solar thermal, into the process is something we're looking at more and more for minerals processing, for chemical processing,
processamento de químicos e minerais, usando o armazenamento termal de energia para apoiar algumas dessas, descarbonizar alguns desses setores.
Opportunities in much of our mining sector, where we have sun, we do require heat, and we've got an opportunity to integrate this with other systems. So we've got quite a bit of work there, and that's another way of looking at the picture as not one winner, but many winners. So, the general story there is that we are creating a whole new industry, but it's an industry composed mainly of industries working together so that we can achieve the scale. And from Australia's perspective, we are looking at making our renewables exportable, both on the back of developing a domestic market and also developing a stronger international market and working closely with groups around the world, like Singapore, an ideal hydrogen hub for utilisation and distribution studies, with Japan and Korea, with groups like Brazil on the agricultural side of things. The biomass to hydrogen opportunities, I think, are really strong. How do we integrate these industries is a challenge, and the infrastructure to do that pilot scale work, I think, is really important. Looking at sensible carriers based on existing industries, I think that's a no-brainer. I think that we need to be able to use the knowledge we have and the industries we have and the scale we have to just help some of the users get into the industry. I had some of the shipping companies say to me once, we're not even going to start unless we know that we've got capacity to convert our $5 billion worth of fuel each year in this pathway, because the infrastructure commitments are too high. So that will see a change in the model, change in the financing model, where those types of companies will in fact be amortizing their business and investing up the value chain and contributing to development of the hydrogen and in that case the ammonia production capabilities and technologies. And the only way we're going to do that, as I've said, are partnerships. So partnerships to facilitate research development, but a strong emphasis, in my view, on demonstration and deployment through dot joining or connecting technologies and markets so that we can get those industrial scale demonstrations working. And the hub concept is really the way that we can make that work here and now using existing industries. CSIRO has trying to find mechanisms to facilitate that. We've created things called missions, which really address some of the national challenges. So the hydrogen industry mission is really focused on helping to coordinate that connection. So through things like a knowledge centre where we get a bit of an understanding of who's doing what and what's some of the background knowledge, looking at some of the feasibility and the strategic studies, supporting where we can demonstration projects, and working with our colleagues, obviously, in the key science and technology enablers, all in a view to try and help the industry grow to the scales that are, sort of dreamed of, I guess, through our government and through our industry partners. who are coming on. Now, there are some strong industry leading initiatives as well. One is the HILT CRC, as we call it, the Heavy Industry Low Carbon Transition CRC, has just been announced in the last few weeks. That is specifically focused on decarbonising heavy industry, and the mining industry features very strongly, both in the principal members and in the research programs, looking here at iron upstream, so iron ore industries, green iron, green steel applications, the alumina industry, very important for decarbonisation, and of course the cement industry. So they're front and centre in this particular CRC. As I said, lots of these technologies are cross-cutting technologies. They're technologies that don't have to be reinvented, but do need to be adapted and scaled and integrated with some of the processes that are already operational at scale. So that's an important program which we'd be participating in, and I think quite a number of opportunities there for technologies to work with real practical industrial systems. And of course, roadmaps, techno-economics, some of those support things common to all of these industries. So this is an exciting new opportunity. It's about $40 million being approved from government, leveraging significantly into many partners. The bigger logos put in more money, the smaller logos less, but it's a really a nice opportunity to bring together those roadmaps, the value chains, and some of the initiatives that are coming together. Lots more we can talk about, but I'll leave it at that for now, and hopefully we can address some of the questions that you have. Thank you, and apologies for my bad internet. Oops.
No, thank you very much, David. Fascinating talk, particularly the discussion around ammonia versus hydrogen. We've talked so far this morning or today, this evening, Brazil time, at the policy level about getting the settings right, about the potential opportunities. We've talked about some of the different technologies that might add into this potential new industry. In this next presentation, we're going to be talking about how to adapt all of this to the mine site level and what it means for a major mining company. So our final speaker is Mr. Thiago Alves, who's the environmental manager at Anglo American Brazil. Thiago studied social sciences and a Master of Social Anthropology and Archaeology at the Federal University of Minas Gerais. Alves has extensive experience in environmental impact analysis and management, planning and execution of ESG platforms in capital-intensive businesses. He currently holds the position of environmental manager at Anglo American Brazil, with responsibilities for environmental recovery, forest protection, environmental quality, ESG, circular economy, and mine closure. I would now like to introduce Thiago.
So thank you so much, Daniel. Thank you all. First of all, it's been a privilege to be here among these so relevant researchers and professors. Okay, and on behalf of Anglo American, I want to thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you, our secretary, Mr. Bruno Eustáquio, and also the Sustainable Minerals Institute, which I had the pleasure to pass through a training program for executives in sustainability. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Brilliant webinar today. So now I move to Portuguese, okay, for my presentation. I think it will make sense. Então, eu gostaria de saber só rapidinho se a
I'd just like to know real quick if the translation is working fine. Can everyone hear me? The English speakers can hear the translator fine?
Daniel?
Yeah, that seems fine. That seems fine, Thiago.
Daniel, can you hear the translation?
Thank you so much.
Muito obrigado. So I'll try to speak a little bit slower. So I have not prepared a full presentation. I just like to discuss a few points as a member of the mining industry, but all the points that have been brought up so far by the colleagues, the researchers who so brilliantly presented this first portion, this first three panels, they truly are a part of the reality of my work and this seeking and energy transition, something we are looking for with the entire society. Anglo American considers essential that we reach the Paris Climate Accord goals and that we can truly decarbonize our production base so that we not only will reach the global goals, which is what we have to do, but that we can also move ahead as and continue as a competitive mining company. To talk about Anglo American, this is a diversified company with a global presence. In addition to Australia and Brazil, we have a significant presence in Canada, Chile, Peru, South Africa, Botswana, and other countries as well. We have a recent operation in England. We are a diversified mining company, and we have a clear purpose. We want to reimagine mining to improve people's lives. In these reimagination of mining to improve people's lives, energy transition is one of the pillars and is part of what we call the Sustainable Mining Plan, a set of actions and ideas that has three main targets in different pillars. One is to reduce carbon emissions and greenhouse effect gases, and to ensure carbon neutrality by 2040. In addition, Anglo America also develops a program called Future Smart Mine, which is a series of technological solutions that might revolutionize the way mining is conducted. We believe that in the next 10 years, mining will undergo such changes, such transitions as it has probably never gone through in the last 300 years. The arrival of new technologies will certainly help us. And in fact, one of the initiatives that is part of Future Smart Mine is the use of hydrogen in our substitutions. Energy transition is not something new for mankind. We've gone through it a few times. We believe we're going through a new one now. Finding a substitute for a fossil energy-based economy is something that is extremely important, particularly over the next 10 years. In addition to being a social issue, it's an issue that can generate jobs. It's an opportunity to reduce inequality by the creation of sustainable business. Hydrogen, in a way, as we've discussed here, is part of an ecosystem, and this ecosystem may be distributed in a chain. And when we talk about a chain, when we talk about chain reactions and chain actions, we discuss the possibility of creating value. So here we're talking effectively about the growth of a sector, which is a new business that may effectively contribute in a positive manner to generating value for people in the economy as a whole. Thinking about mining, I'll try to be a bit more explicit in terms of our role. Mining has two main emitters of greenhouse gas emission. First, electrical energy. We consume a lot of power. Second, fossil fuels that are responsible for supplying our exchanges with low efficiency and high emission levels. So on the one hand, we have clear solutions considering electric energy. The cost of production of electric energy has been reducing. In terms of renewable electrical energy, has been going down significantly over the last few years, and we have been applying this to our business. I have the pleasure to say that the businesses in South America have been ensuring the supply of 100% renewable energy from 2022 in Anglo America. This will effectively contribute to reduce the emissions of our business and will also increase the resilience of our operations. Naturally, this is not enough. Hydrogen is part of the scenario as an alternative to replace fossil fuels. We are considering fossil fuels that supply the trucks and our fleet of heavy trucks, heavy vehicles. Mining depends on it to operate. And then we have some questions that come up. Of course, the best alternative would be to have a simple substitute, for example, for a heavy oil such as diesel, which we used on off-road trucks. That could be something as a plug and play, and that we could immediately change the energy grid and everything would be so. But we know things are not that simple. As it was quite well presented by our colleagues that spoke before me, There's a large ecosystem connected to hydrogen. The ways to produce it, to store it, transmission it are many, and we have been studying the technology. But we need to understand that these new technologies need to be within a cooperative system where research, production, private companies, and governments, third sector, society, where they are all together looking for alternatives. Hydrogen also has a very important characteristic for us. It can be an inductor of circular economy. Within the potential systems for producing hydrogen, we have a wide range of alternatives that would enable the creation of value, not only for the company, but for the communities. This is quite clear in new mining. What we need to do, we need to generate value for our host communities. We need to do that. And this has to be planned in a chain. Also thinking in an integrated manner, we see important solutions, provided that there is the possibility to create networks that will fill in this gap, which is the absence of a preliminary structure for hydrogen. We are creating the transition now. This is normal for it to be this way. And of course, I believe Brazil and Australia have major similarities in this sense, because the potential for use of green hydrogen in this case, because this is not a new technology. This has been said very well here. We're talking about the use of hydrogen in a way that is not creating more greenhouse gas emissions. So what is Anglo American thinking about in terms of hydrogen? In the first point, a significant investment in the chains for and networks for debate and discussion on hydrogen itself. We are founders of Men of Hydrogen Council in China, which is basically composed of by over 100 members today, and the Hydrogen Fuel Cell Association in China. Another initiative that we're also founding members in the Green Hydrogen Heavy Industry Consortium in Australia. We believe that these hubs, these stages for cooperation are important to find technologies that are required to effectively apply green hydrogen, blue hydrogen, low emission hydrogen in our processes. Technology today is truly an important part in our strategy. Recently, our global CEO has announced the results of the group, which is very positive, last week regarding the first quarter of 2021. And something that still gets our attention, and this is public, I can put it in the chat later, anyone can see it. It's a presentation for our investors and general public, showing the advances in the application of hydrogen in our businesses. Currently, we have 5 working fronts working together, integrating and understanding technologies involved in producing hydrogen for off-road trucks. We need to develop power cells, fuel cells, safe storage. We need to develop production. We need to integrate all of that in the business plan. This is what we are working on. If we are able to get electric energy from renewable sources, taking advantage of the moments where we have greater production, cheaper production, we can store hydrogen. Then, using this in our fleets, we will effectively have a way forward for decarbonization. One point here is that this is not enough by itself. So we also develop technologies such as direct capture, as we've discussed here earlier, and direct capture as an alternative so that we can become suppliers of raw materials for the production of other low carbon, low emission products in the chain. I think my time is almost over.
I'll finish in 2 minutes, okay? So, então, dentro da jornada do Anglo-American, né?
Then in the Anglo-American journey, one of the decarbonization, the replacement of trucks is important. We are worried about creating a value chain. We want to act in a partnership with other territory agents and to transform the hydrogen business in something that is positive and can generate value for all interested parties. We have inside the fence production processes and using logic for hydrogen, but we're not counting exclusively on hydrogen because we believe that it's impossible to get entire decarbonification only with hydrogen. We need to think this as a structured business in a partnership idea with other companies, other institutions, governments, and researchers. And of course, looking into pilot projects. Currently, our pilot project is a mine in Africa. We want to have the whole fleet powered by hydrogen by 2026, and then an iron mine in Brazil that will also be fueled by hydrogen. And by 2040, we want to get to carbon neutrality by associating another reductions in the emission of greenhouse gases and finding integrated solutions. In general ways, that's the Anglo-American platform. That's what we're looking for. This is how we see hydrogen in terms of research, cooperation, and replacing the fuels currently used, together with a broader strategy in territory, generation of value, and use of renewable energies in our process. I believe that's what I've had to say when it comes to mining. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Thiago. Thank you to all of our speakers. It's been a fascinating conversation this morning, from the strategy, the policy level, all the way down to the mine site level, and thinking about how do we transition the whole mining production value chain into something that is totally renewable in terms of its energy sources. So before I formally end today's webinar, which is also the end to our series, it's been a fantastic series that we've held. I'd like to hand over to Mr. Frederico Oliveira to say a few final remarks. Frederico is the Director of Geology and Mineral Production at the Secretariat of Geology, Mining and Mineral Transformation in Brazil's Ministry of Mines and Energy. He's been instrumental to organising this webinar series in partnership with the Australian Embassy in Brazil. So, Frederico.
Hello, Daniel. Hello, everyone. Obrigado. Eu gostaria de nessas
Thank
palavras.
you very much. I'd like to say a few final words. I'd like to thank you for the partnership with the Australian Embassy in Brazil and SMI. These were 3 seminars that were very current with the dynamics of the mining market and the demands in society, where we can discuss very important topics when it comes to sustainability. And I'm sure that these discussions will be very important to formulate public policy. These topics bring up the needs for the sustainable development, the decarbonification of economy, energy transformation, and the whole of mining to contribute to these changes, to use renewable energies, as Thiago mentioned, and other topics. So I think the 3 workshops were quite important. In a way, they were connected to each other in terms of sustainable development. And I'm sure that these experiences that have been exchanged between Brazil and Australia were important. So I hope the partnership with SMI and the Australian Embassy will continue and generate more fruits. So once more, I'd like to reiterate my thanks. And we are at your disposal as the Ministry from Brazil. So good night from Brazil. Good morning in Australia. And thank you all of our participants who have been here with us on all 3 workshops. Thank you.
Thank you, Frederico. It has been great. Thank you for your efforts to make this whole webinar series possible. We've now reached the close of the webinar and the series. I'd like to express some sincere thanks to some special people who have made this webinar series possible. His Excellency, Mr. Timothy Kane, the Australian Ambassador to Brazil, Mr. Alexandre Vidigal, the Secretary of Geology, Mining and Mineral Transformation at the Ministry of Mines and Energy in Brazil, Professor Neville Plint, the Director of the Sustainable Minerals Institute, Mr. Andrew Edge, the Deputy Chief of Mission at the Australian Embassy in Brazil, Mr. Caio Jacon, also of the Australian Embassy for his support in planning these webinars, Ms. Jill Ivers and also Connor from the SMI communications team, and Dr. Paul Rogers, who's worked very hard behind the scenes. He hasn't had a role in presenting, but he has very much coordinated these 3 events using his networks to bring the speakers together. Thank you to all of our expert speakers and panelists from Australia, Brazil that have made the series such a success. We've had a great response, a lot of attendance. We are really appreciative of all of the efforts that have been put in place. So that's it from me. If you've got any feedback, please don't hesitate to reach out to contact us in coming weeks. We will send to all of the participants that have been part of our series links to where they can get the webinars online. Thank you, good night and good morning. Talk to you again soon.
Bye-bye.